Hello, everyone. Today is Friday, the 27th. I apologize for not uploading in quite some time now. I think my last upload was the 10th, so it was over 2 weeks ago. I've been out with a cold, and I can't really record lectures at the same time. Um, and frankly, I feel like I supplemented that as best I could with information that I put in the week 8 and week 9 folder. If you check week 8 and week 9 out, you should be able to see articles that I linked and lots of podcasts in lieu of lecture. I know that's not really, necessarily the best supplement, but I felt that that was a necessary one. But now I can continue where we kind of left off. I had several students email me this past week about form. Um, I think one of the questions I asked in discussion board, if I can check real quick for a moment, I think in week 9, yeah, the one you're completing right now, actually. Week 9, the first question asks to choose one of the three poems and explore how the claim that Billy Collins makes, that free verse, despite its lack of rigidity and apparent form, still possesses some form. And I had several students email me about what I meant by form, and I gave different answers depending on the question that was asked and how it was raised. But essentially, form is one of these weird sort of topics that changes depending on who you ask. And that is made, I think, more obvious when you go to different websites that talk about form. My favorite website, though, is Poetry Foundation, and you probably have realized that by now by seeing some of the links that I've given. I love them because they have several podcasts. They're obviously out of their magazine called Poetry Magazine. And I think exploring their site is actually really helpful. Not only do they have a search by a poem or poet that you'd like to read, you can also, if you want to, if let's say I'm searching for a specific poem, I can go to the homepage for poems. I can search not just by subject, but also by school. So if I wanted the Romantics or the Objectivists or the Confessions or the Imagists, as I spoke earlier, you can see all the schools of thought and so on that come out here. And I love the way they've sort of broken down the page. But back to this idea of form, I feel like there is really no good answer to that, because there have been so many schools of thought that sort of try to tackle one approach to form. For example, we started off this semester talking about formalism, and that the formalism that we're familiar with would be considered the new critics sort of formalism. That came out in the early to mid 20th century, almost 100 years ago, and that sort of has been a traditional sort of bedrock type of theory of how we look at literature in general, not just at poetry. And so they would define it in one way, and the way they look at it is like, well, we only want to look at poetry as it exists within itself, right? So we don't care about the author, we don't care about the historical background, we really just want to see what's inside of this poem. And of course, they get a lot of flack from people who do look at, like, for instance, new historicism, which does look at historical context. So, we want some historical context if we were reading a poem like Dulce de Cormest or the Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, because those are obviously war poems that were written during a time of war and referenced specific machines and weapons that only became manifest in those wars. So sometimes when we look at a poem's form, we have to then consider, well, form by what definition? And that's what's tricky. But I came up with, or I found a good article. If you go to Poetry Foundation, what I love is that if you have a question about a specific issue, and I'm showing this to you now so that way if you have further questions, of course you can always ask me. But if you want a quick answer and you would like to do some research, I think this is an excellent site to use. If I type in the word form, for instance, in the search bar, you'll notice that I can refine my search, because right now it's going to give me some poems. Actually, all of these are poems that just happen to have the word form. Here's an essay on poetic theory, which I don't know if you want to write. And here's an article for students. Here's some an essay or some prose from Poetry Magazine, and so on and so forth. If you want to reduce it, you can go back up to the search, and it says you can refine by poems, maybe some poets that have the name form, I suppose. Articles that mention form, any collections that they have, audio, video, something from their magazine directly, their blog, so on. I like to go to their articles, and there's two articles here that show up almost immediately. There's Denise Levertov's 1965 essay called Some Notes on Organic Form, and her argument for what organic form is. But this is the one I shared, actually. If you go to the week 10 folder, I think, let me see. Week 10. Yeah, The Pursuit of Form by Robert Pinsky. That's the article. It's here, and it's articles for students. And I think, this is an excellent article. It's not too long. It's, let's see. Yeah, because it's got a lot of examples here. I would say it's about 1,000 words. It's not. It's about as long as one of your essays might be. But I love Robert Pinsky both as a poet and as a critic. I think he's got excellent poetry. And he's done some really great things as far as how we look at poetry, how we should look at poetry, or at least his opinion of how we should look at poetry. And I think this article would be helpful for all of you. I think if you're not sure what form is, his introduction I think is really great. In fact, let me read it for you for a moment. He says, "Here's another way of thinking about body knowledge and poetry. Pursuing excellence, athletes and musicians willingly, even eagerly, submit themselves to tedious, grinding repetition and analysis. They try to cultivate by practice the most effective way of doing each thing, each best movement so reliably summoned that you don't need to think about it in the fluid, immediate, rapid, intuitive performance of your skills. The goal, in a word used by those who work in these pursuits, is to perfect their form." And I love that example he gives, that when we think of form, it's best not to think just in what does form mean in terms of poetry? Well, think about how form is used in any art. And he uses athletes and musicians as examples. He says, if any of you have ever played a sport, or if any of you have ever tried picking up an instrument, you know that there's no way you can do a certain task until you've kept working at it over and over again. But there's no sort of right way of doing it. Right now the World Series is going on between the Astros and the Dodgers, and some of the commentators, when I was watching the game, one of the analysts said that there's this whole new way of how hitters are meant to swing the bat to get up and under the ball. And it's kind of interesting that when we think about how the form has changed in, let's say, the last 10 years, it's changed drastically. And so there really is no right or wrong way. Well, I suppose there are plenty of wrong ways to hit a ball with a bat, but there is no best way. It really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Same thing with music. I play guitar and piano. I have a twin brother. He plays alto saxophone. I have a younger brother. He plays mellophone and trumpet. And if any of you have ever played an instrument, you would know that trying to hit a key with a certain speed, or trying to hit any note at a certain speed, or with a certain tone, or a certain loudness, certain pitch, is a work in progress. It's not like you're going to get it the first time. It's like, oh, I'm going to study, a famous musician who plays that instrument, and I'm just going to copy them. I suppose that is one way of doing it, but that's not really art, right? That's sort of like a mathematical approach to, or a scientific approach to music. And same thing with athletes. We can watch some of the best athletes. If any of us love soccer, we might watch Ronaldo or Messi and watch them play. But the reality is we may not be able to duplicate the same sort of form and repetitions that they do. So all we can really do is try to get close, or maybe adapt some of the techniques they use into our own game, our own form. And that's one way of thinking about poetry, is that, when we are trying to accomplish something, depending on what that thing is, we're going to follow some sort of form to get it, right? Think of, if you look at some of the poems, let me go to the course materials for a moment. If we look at some of the poems, like Traveling Through the Dark, for instance, I think Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford is obviously trying to accomplish this sort of commentary on a horrible, horrible situation where the speaker has to make a choice, right? Whoever that character is, it may be himself or maybe this fictitious person, but the person inside that poem has to make this awful choice. And the way he sort of works within the poem, you notice there's not that much rhyme, because he feels, maybe William Stafford must have thought to himself, as he's writing this poem, that, well, I don't know if rhyme really serves a purpose or some sort of need for my message, right? When we think of rhyme, we think of something to be like sort of rhythmic, and it should have some sort of pattern. But if the pattern doesn't really serve a purpose, or it takes away from your message, or it distracts from your message, then perhaps rhyme isn't necessary. And so he does that, right? Instead, as many of you pointed out in your discussion board postings, he relies more on imagery, right? And sort of this metaphor. Some of you mentioned the car and the red glare from the car as sort of this personification or anthropomorphism on the part of the vehicle, and sort of his subconscious about what he's thinking, right? Sort of like the devil on his shoulder. And so this is important because obviously the image and that metaphor are far more powerful and carry much more weight than, say, rhyme would, or alliteration for that matter. But it's not, it's still important, the sort of language he's using, right? We talked about, I think some of you talked about swerving, for instance, right? He talks about, he uses the word swerving ambiguously, right? It could mean swerving literally like on a road, right? If you're on a car and you're trying to avoid collision with something, you swerve out of the way. But he talks about his only swerving, deciding, wondering whether or not he should push that deer off, the doe off. And he says he swerves for a moment. And obviously he doesn't mean literally inside of a car, because he's outside of the car at this moment. But he swerves in another way to mean sort of like he faltered, or he had doubts for a moment, and he swerved out of the direction of the necessity in front of him, the fact that he couldn't really swerve away from what needed to be done. And so, how we approach poems here is obviously going to vary. And when we think of form, we don't want to think of form as this sort of strict, rigid definition. Form changes, really depending on the purpose of a poem. So when I asked you to look at Billy Collins, one specific form of poetry is called free verse, and that's something he makes reference to inside the podcast. Free verse is sort of poetry that doesn't conform to rhyme, and it doesn't conform to meter. If you think of like Shakespeare's sonnets, for instance, that is not free verse. It does follow a specific sort of rhyme and specific meter. If you look at any of the sonnets, it's got A B. I think it's A B A B C D C D E F E F G G rhyme scheme, and then most of the lines are iambic pentameter, and usually the last two lines are iambic tetrameter. So there is this very specific form, and by form here I mean like this pattern or this sort of formula that is followed in order to get some sort of message across. And it's not just a formula in terms of rhyme and meter, it's also a formula of what is contained in each of those lines. We would normally say that in one of those Shakespearean sonnets, the first 4 lines introduce some issue, the next 4 lines or 6 lines, 4 to 6 lines, give a metaphor about that issue and have some sort of comparison. And the last 2 lines, those rhyming couplets, those last 2 lines usually resolve this metaphor and try to bring out a bigger message. And that's usually the pattern. And if you look at any of his sonnets, they usually follow that pattern over and over and over again. So he was a master of the sonnet form. You also read Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. That is a VNL, right? And it's a VNL because many poems follow that same pattern of introducing 2 lines in that first stanza that would then be alternately repeated throughout the poem, and follow a very strict rhyme scheme of I think it's ABA, BCB, C. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on I'm losing the rhyme scheme in my head, but I'm sure if you go back to the poem, you should be able to identify the rhyme scheme for yourself. And if you look up any other VNLs, you should be able to identify them by the same pattern. So what Billy Collins here is saying that free verse, these poems that don't adhere to these really strict closed forms, many critics would say, well, they have no rigidity, right? They don't really have an apparent form. But Billy Collins says, no, there is still some form with these poems. So I'm asking you to choose one of his poems and essentially tell me, well, how is that true? Show me how what patterns he is relying on. Where does the form come from then? If it doesn't come from meter and rhyme, where does the form come from? And that might help you out later when we talk for the week 10 discussion, which I want to talk about very briefly since you haven't started yet and it's not due until next week. We're going to be reading 2 more poets. One's going to be Taylor Malley. He's in the much younger generation. He's the generation sort of after Billy Collins, and I think he kind of speaks my soul. I think he says exactly what I feel like all the time. That's why I love him so much. And he has several great books, and a lot of them have been audio versions of them. And that's he's really the reason I got into poetry when I was an undergraduate. So I really feel like sharing him with all of you because I feel maybe he'll speak to one of you. So we're going to cover Taylor Malley, and I think you'll find him hilarious. He's got a great sense of humor. And then after that, we're going to cover arguably the best American poet, and that's Walt Whitman. He's coming now. He was alive in the 19th century, so this is he's comes way before Billy Collins or Taylor Malley, a long time ago. But he kind of set the bar for essentially the path that American poetry would later take, and we'll see how that really turns out and how that's true. But Billy Collins and Taylor Malley are obviously very different, and that's kind of what I'm asking you to do. The first question asks, well, based on the 3 poems that you read from him, how would you describe his approach to poetry? 2, what patterns emerge in the poems? When you compare his work to the work of others that we've read in this class, what does he value in his poems? In other words, what's more important? Because some poets you can read and you can tell, like, oh, they clearly care a lot about rhyme, or lots of poets care about alliteration, or synecdoche, or apostrophe. And there's so many forms here, and you can have a quick glance through your glossary of poetic terms to find some of these patterns, because a lot of them already have names for them, but you just aren't familiar with them yet. What I'm asking you to do here is just to look carefully at his poems and what sort of patterns do you see, either in language, either in rhyme, or maybe forget language, but think about image that's summoned, right? So you can focus on whatever you'd like as long as you show me some of those patterns. And lastly, I love number 3. If you hadn't noticed, when Mally is performing What Teachers Make, it's one of the poems I assigned, there's the man on a stage with him, and it's Billy Collins, someone we just read. And it turns out, so lots of poets in form sort of these poetry circles. In fact, I got to meet Ken Jones and Chuck Jones. I met Billy Collins at a conference years ago, and then I got a chance to meet Eduardo Villanueva probably 3 years ago at a workshop in Austin. So I mean, a lot of poets kind of go in the same circles, and it's really great to meet them all. But what I would not like you guys to try to figure out is, even though these people run in the same circles, do you think they approach poetry in the same way? Why or why not? And chances are that maybe there are some similarities, but I think there are definitely more differences, and that's what I'd like you all to focus on, at least for week 10 discussion. Now, before I move on, I do want to talk a little more about form. There are so many types of form, and really, I think one of my favorite articles here that you might be interested in, if you go back to the Poetry Foundation, one of the articles for students is called "Why Write in Form" by Rebecca Hazelton. She's talking about this idea like, hey, forms are kind of antiquated, they're kind of old, who writes in form anymore? And she makes the argument, well, like if you're a burgeoning poet, if you're barely starting out, form might be the best way to go, right? And it's so true. When I first started learning poetry, I was one of the first forms I was taught was a ballad. After a ballad, I did limericks. Then I did VNLs, and we did sonnets. I finally started moving on to terza rima, which is an Italian form. And you go on and on and on and on. But it's not until you master sort of these basic forms before you finally get into, well, now what can you experiment with? Now you can start sort of pushing the envelope and see what you can do and still get away with, right? So that might be an excellent article for you all to read. And just sort of, I would, go through the site as much as you want, and see what you would like to hear about. If you're interested, you can also go to the Learn tab up here. It's where I got the glossary of poetic terms. If you click on there, obviously it'll take you to this site, and you can just see all these poetry-related terms. There's obviously a whole lot of terms to look through. If there's a word I use that you're not familiar with, this would be an excellent place to just search for it and get familiar with the terms I'm using. And hopefully you use them later in your assignments, both in discussion board and, this is what I want to talk about next, the upcoming literary analysis assignment. So if you go to the week 10 folder, obviously I haven't posted the week 11 folder yet, but the week 10 folder is up already. If you go here, you'll notice that before the poems I've provided for you, there are the instructions for the literary analysis and the article I shared from Poetry Foundation. But let me go through. I've already shared, or talked about pursuit of form. Let's talk about the instructions. So we're going to click on those, open it. Oh boy, sorry for the slow. Is it going to open? There we go. Okay, it opened twice by accident. All right. So you'll notice that the instructions look very similar to the last literary analysis, but it is different. So I want to make sure that I cover this difference for a moment. You'll notice the due date is different. It's November 12th. That's more than 2 weeks away. So today's the 27th. So tomorrow is Saturday the 28th. Then there's the 29th. So that's Sunday. And you have 2 weeks, essentially. Says, I think, yeah, the 12th should land, yeah, right here. So you have a little bit more than 2 weeks to start working on the literary analysis. Now, you'll notice that there is no rough draft due. That does not mean you don't have to do a rough draft. You obviously should. And I explained that later in the instructions. If you scroll down, I still encourage you to visit the Writing Center. You can also just ask me. You can email me with a draft that you have, and I can look over it for you and tell you what I think can be improved and so on, and whether or not you're on the right track. And of course, I think you should share it with your classmates. You know, you have peers. You can get their emails from Blackboard and email them with perhaps a draft or two, and ask them what they think. But before I do that, let me again also talk about what's different here. So it's still literary analysis. You're still going to analyze poetry, but now let me go through this very carefully. It says you will be required to choose either Billy Collins, Taylor Malley, or Walt Whitman, right? One of the three big poets that we're covering in per week, and one other poet from the following options. And we have Jack McCarthy, William Stafford, Wilfred Owen, and Randall Jarrell. So in other words, you need to choose one of the poets in bold and one of the poets in italics. So you can choose, for example, you can say Collins and McCarthy, or Collins and Stafford, or Collins and Owen, and Collins and Jarrell. Or you could do Malley or McCarthy, Malley and Stafford, Malley and Owen. But it has to be one of these bold poets, just one of these, and one of these italicized. Okay? And the idea is you're going to now answer this question, or several questions. Select 2 or more poems that contain a moment of conflict. So the poems that you select need to come from, obviously, the 2 poets that you choose, right? So select 2 or more poems that contain a moment of conflict. What creates or builds up to this moment of conflict, obviously, in each poem? What perspectives do you identify in this conflict, and what perspectives would you bring into your analysis of this conflict? How would you reach a resolution of this conflict? Now, the reason I wanted to choose more than one poet is really because if you just did this about one poem, I feel like there wouldn't be enough to talk about. And if you really just did, let's say you did 2 or more poems by the same poet, I feel like the conflict would sort of repeat itself, because usually poets tend to talk about similar conflicts over and over again. So what I'd like you to do is look at really 2 different poets and their poetry and see where conflict comes from and how they deal with conflict. I think you'll find that there sometimes are common themes where conflict comes from. So one way you can sort of approach this assignment is you can try to find 2 poems from these poets that you choose that have similar conflict, and try to explore how this conflict is built up, or how it's created, or where it comes from. If you don't want to do that, you could also do 2 completely different poems and sort of analyze one at a time, and then sort of come to some bigger conclusion about both. But you have complete governance about how you want to approach this assignment. All I ask is that you still need to have a thesis, and let me go over that here. The assignment should be somewhere between 900 and 1,200 words. You should have several paragraphs. One should have be a separate introductory paragraph. There should be a strong thesis statement somewhere in that introductory paragraph, which is supported by appropriate examples and elements from your chosen, that should say poems. I should say poems, I apologize. That is supported effectively by appropriate examples and elements from your chosen poems. And that's obviously going to appear in several body paragraphs. And then finally, we'll have a separate concluding paragraph, followed by a works cited listing of whichever poems you used. If they came from the book, obviously you would use a different sort of citation than if it came from online. And of course, your essay should follow formal grammar, mechanics, spelling, sentence structure, conventions, that sort of thing. Your paper will be graded for how effective your thesis is, right? Making sure that you are answering the prompt somehow and that you're making some sort of argument that addresses the prompt. How well you support that thesis, right? How well you use logic and reasoning and how you got to your answer, and how well you appropriately include literary terms and elements, how well you use examples from the text to support your thesis, and of course, whether or not you're following MLA style for pretty much everything else. And then finally, how well you follow organization and grammar and mechanics, that sort of thing. Okay. Now, if you have any questions about any of this, feel free, of course, to email me or text me. Some of you have been texting me, so that's great. I always welcome texts from students. I may not get to your text immediately, though. I know, for instance, one student last week, maybe it was this week, I think it was last week, texted me, but I was in the middle of class. And so that's, I teach class Mondays and Wednesdays on the Edinburgh campus. And so I tend not to be able to be close to my phone for most of that day, most of Monday and Wednesdays. But once I get home, I usually can, text students pretty quickly, and email, same thing. I usually wait to respond to emails in the evening once I've gotten home and settled down. So I think that's all I wanted to cover in this integrity lecture. Keep in mind that I've shared not just the article and the instructions. Of course, all of the readings, you'll notice that there's a performance, and then there's just basically the written poem for you. So you can compare the two if you'd like. I, for instance, love to hear a poem performed. I don't like just reading it. So if there is a performance available, I'll always share it. So that's what these are. It's the performance and then just the poem by itself. Performance and poem, performance and poem. You'll also notice that I included a podcast from Poetry Foundation. One of their podcasts is called Poetry Off the Shelf, and it's called Teaching Poetry in Times Like These. I think it's a great podcast because you get to see the perspective of a teacher and how they want to teach poetry. And the teacher in this case, I forgot her name, but she's a high school teacher who teaches poetry at a high school that's basically intended for students who are going to end up majoring in English or some form of poetic liberal arts. So I think it's really interesting to sort of get their perspective and how they approach poetry, and maybe that might give you some insight. It's a really short podcast. I think it's like 15 minutes long. So if you're interested and you're on the way to work or you're driving somewhere, pop it in to your stereo and, have a listen to it. It shouldn't take too long, and maybe you might get something good out of it. All right. As always, feel free to email me or talk to me, or you can always call too. Just let me know ahead of time when you want to talk, so that way I can make sure I arrange my schedule so I can talk to you over the phone. I'll go ahead and fix the small error that was on the instructions for the literary analysis, and I think that should be it. All right, y'all take it easy.